Hi, this is our pre-reading lecture for our article by Schrank. We'll be talking about public art, sense of place, and how do we define nation. So, in order to talk about the mural projects and other public art projects that our article gets into, we want to talk a little bit about what's going on politically, culturally, etc., leading up to the Great Depression. And then, in particular, we'll focus in on Los Angeles and talk about how LA is trying to define itself as a tourist destination in the 1930s. So, the 20s are complicated. So during the teens and 20s, we see a lot of huge demographic shifts happening in the United States as the United States becomes increasingly urban as opposed to rural. So lots of people moving from the American countryside to the city. And we see tons and tons of immigration from Europe and Asia throughout the teens and 20s as well. And the 20s are complicated, right? That's why we got this idea of modernization and backlash. So on the one hand, the 20s are marked by expanding rights for some, so women get the right to vote in 1920. And on the other hand, we see this kind of lingering xenophobia, that is the fear of the other from the First World War that took place during the 1910s. And so we see this kind of increasing anxiety around a diverse nation and this lingering fear of outsiders left over from the war, leading to legislative action in 1924 that limited all Asian immigration. And so when we're thinking about the 20s, they're also marked by increasing revivals of hate groups such as the KKK. So the KKK is opposed to immigration and integration, and these groups are revived during this era as well. And partially, the revival of the Ku Klux Klan is inspired by D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, that was released in 1915, that celebrated the KKK as heroes. So that tells us a little bit about the influence of media and film during this era as well. Okay, so the other thing that happens in the 1920s is the prohibition of alcohol. And the prohibition of alcohol reflects this desire to return to the United States and its Puritan past. And so this idea that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity is the best form of American identity begins to shape, right, the prohibition of alcohol, the rise of hate groups like the KKK, and this overall suspicion or fear of outsiders and concern over this quote-unquote changing nature of American identity during this era. Okay, so the other thing we probably know that happens in the 1920s is that the Great Depression starts. So in the 20s, we have a sense that this was an era marked by unscrupulous investment, so wild economic speculation, high-risk investments. And so there was this sense in the 20s that the stock market could only grow. And so that meant that bankers and folks at other financial institutions ignored tons of warning signs that were out there that the economy was slowing down and continued to invest in super risky ventures. And this led to the huge stock market crash that's referred to as Black Tuesday happening in 1929. So the stock market crashes and the United States is thrown into a huge economic depression. All right, and it lasts through the 40s. So in 1933, we see Franklin D. Roosevelt being elected president, and his campaign platform was the New Deal that we may have read about in an American history class as well. So he's inheriting a nation that is ravaged by unemployment, homelessness, famine, a huge, giant social and economic mess, right? So his plan for recovery had these three prongs, or these three pillars to it: relief, recovery, and reform. So relief is about meeting people's immediate needs, right? So helping with food, helping with shelter, things of that nature. Recovery of the economy to normal levels. So this involves the creation of work programs, right? So the federal government begins to employ unemployed Americans in the construction of tons and tons of infrastructure projects that we'll talk about in a moment through the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. And then reform of financial systems to prevent a repeat depression. So that last one proved to be pretty sticky, that our financial system would be reformed in such a way that people couldn't wildly enrich themselves at the expense of economic stability, but turns out we still let that happen. Okay. So yeah, let's talk about the Works Progress Administration. So this is one of the largest of the New Deal agencies that were developed during this period of the New Deal. And so millions of individuals were employed to do these huge public works projects. So we see a lot of the infrastructure that we still use to this day was constructed in the 1930s by these unemployed individuals who got jobs with the American government and built vital infrastructure, including schools, libraries, parks, community centers, hospitals, roads, bridges, all the super important stuff, the kind of stuff of everyday life, the stuff that improves quality of life on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, these projects are all over the LA area. So some of the projects that we might be familiar with, ta-da, the C building, where we would be if we weren't doing this remotely. So yeah, but also other projects like the Grove Park Observatory, one of our famous landmarks, Angeles Crest Highway. So if you've ever driven up into the mountains, those are the roads from the 30s. And then various schools and parks as well that we may be familiar with. So tons of stuff all over LA that was constructed thanks to the Works Progress Administration. So PCC's beautiful campus comes thanks to this government project, the Works Progress Administration. Pretty cool. Okay, so the other part of this project, the Works Progress Administration, that we're going to spend some time talking about is the Arts Project. And so the Public Works of Art Project borrows heavily from Mexican muralism. So what we see happening in the arts in the United States is that they are borrowing from this idea that was developed in post-revolutionary Mexico. So as we talked about in our discussion of the Mexican Revolution, with the election of Cardenas, we see the development of public art as a kind of central interest of this new government. So the government's putting money into the production of public art, and part of this is in an effort to create this kind of official shared history of the revolution, because as we know, it was a really challenging era in which many different factions of Mexican society were fighting with one another. So there's a desire to create unity after this as well, and to create murals that were this form of mass communication, right? A way to tell a story in a visual language that's accessible for all, and to kind of create art that's about political and social engagement. So storytelling and reminding, right, Mexican individuals of what they fought for during the revolution. Okay, so with that in mind, we want to think about how the U.S. borrows from this in the creation of their own program. So, oh yeah, and we'll talk about Siqueiros, who is one of the chief artists of this movement, who will later come to L.A., as we'll read about. So, the Public Works of Art program is borrowing from this idea that is being developed in Mexico during this era, and we see this putting art at the center of the kind of spiritual recovery of the United States during the Great Depression. So there's this need to, on the one hand, make sure that people are fed and housed and clothed, but then there's this kind of big, hopeless, emotional mess that's part of the Great Depression as well. And so the government sees the arts as a way to kind of tell stories and remind the United States who we are as a nation as well. So we see the U.S. government, for the first time, putting a lot of money into the support of the arts on a national scale. So the Works Progress Administration argues that art is for everybody, that it shouldn't be tucked into a museum, that it shouldn't be in some rich person's house, that it should be all over the surfaces of everyday life, right? So we see tons of artists being employed, and over 35,000 works of art are created. And so the artists are given some directives in terms of what they want represented. So we have the sense that they were asked to create murals that talked about the values of hard work, community, optimism, and so these kind of recognizable, approachable compositions that are celebrating right, the best of American culture. So for example, these are murals in San Francisco in Coit Tower that were completed in 1933. And so what we see here are people back at work, right? We see these idealized versions of Americans back at work in factories and in agricultural labor. So these murals, right, are intended to remind us, right, that we can, in fact, right, get back to work, that we can, in fact, restore our dignity as a nation. And again, right, they're very approachable, they're very idealized, and so this is very characteristic of the murals that were produced by the Public Works of Art Project. Okay, so then let's talk about LA in the 1930s. So LA in the 1930s is engaged in this kind of like rebrand. So yeah, it might be the depths of the Great Depression, but LA is like, we still want to host the Olympics in 1932. Look at us go, right? So if we are familiar with the lead up to City getting ready to host the Olympics, it involves this kind of era of increased attention on issues around urban renewal, this desire to rebrand or reframe a city's identity. So in particular, the individuals in power, most of whom were wealthy white folks, were interested in framing the city as a city that's on the rise, right? It's this cosmopolitan city that is moving away from its Spanish colonial and its Mexican past and entering into its present, right? Its present that is being framed for the benefit of this white Protestant elite as well. And the other thing that always happens during the development of a city during it getting ready to host the Olympics is that downtown LA becomes a center of interest, both cultural and political, right? So this desire to remake downtown LA into this kind of official cultural and political center. So what we see happening here at Olvera Street around La Plaza that we'll talk about a little bit more extensively after we get into our reading for the week. Olvera Street was the center for Mexican cultural, political, commercial, and community life throughout the first 3 decades of the 20th century. So what we see happening here is that there was a real Mexican community, an ethnic enclave in downtown Los Angeles. And so what we see happening from the perspective of City Hall and the folks who are in charge of the Olympic bid is that there's this desire to reframe California's quote-unquote Spanish past, while at the same time vilifying the Mexican community and this idea of framing the Mexican community as a temporary one in Los Angeles, right? That this is like LA's past, not LA's future or its present. So these problematic tendencies result in this renewed interest in downtown LA, and there's this view of the Mexican community that had established La Plaza, established Olvera Street in downtown LA. They're being viewed as disposable, that they're in the way of quote-unquote planning and progress and development. And I'm sure this sounds familiar in terms of our current conversations about gentrification and other forces that are changing LA. Okay. So these are some images about this desire to kind of create this fantasy heritage of this romantic mission past. This is also the moment where we have the development of the mission system as a tourist attraction. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get together, because I'm sure many of you did the mission project when you were in grammar school here in California. So we'll talk about what's going on with these images, what did we not learn about the mission system here in California. Then these are some postcards of downtown LA that give us a sense of how this era is being rebranded. So a touch of old Mexico, and then Little Mexico. So we want to think about what is going on with these phrases, right? What does it mean to call Olvera Street Little Mexico or a touch of Mexico? What's wrong with these descriptions? And as we're looking at these postcards and thinking about this idea, the touch of old Mexico or Little Mexico, does this remind us of other stuff that we've looked at in class so far? So keeping those ideas in mind. The last thing I want you all to do before you jump into your reading by Schrank is to listen to this short excerpt from NPR about what else is going on in Los Angeles in the 1930s when Siqueiros, the artist that I mentioned earlier, begins work on his mural commission that you guys are going to read about rather extensively this week. Okay, so I will see you all later this week. Take care.